On this episode of Ideas, I talk with author Amy Morin about the ideas in her book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. She wrote that back in 2014. Since then, she's also written two other books, 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. She's also written 13 Things Mentally Strong Women Don't Do. Make sure to pick up those books, but in this episode, we mainly talk about her story because what an incredible story it is. She's been through a lot, but it shows that the ideas that she has written about, she has used in her life and they work. But we also discuss breaking bad habits, happiness, living life centered around values, and much more. All right, here we go. All right, today's guest is Amy Morin. She is a psychotherapist turned author, and her mission is to make the world a stronger place. And there are students across 42 countries accessing her online mental strength course. She's here today to talk about her book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. Amy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
And I just mentioned a little bit of what you do, but just from reading your book and watching your TED Talk and some other things, your article that this book turned into, but from mainly the book, your story is something that intrigued me, was very interesting. You've been through a lot in what probably feels like a long time to you, but others might view it as a short time. But I just think it would add a lot of value to listeners for them to maybe see what you've been through, where you've come from to where you are now. And, not only value, but not to say you need more credibility, but the principles that you write about, that you study, that you research, you've applied in your own life and you show that they work. And I just find that really amazing. So if you would, take as much time as you need to, maybe share your story with us.
So I started as a therapist when I was about 22 or 23 and was interested in mental strength, but I thought, I'm going to take all this knowledge, this stuff that I learned from textbooks, and I'm going to apply it to all these people that walk into my therapy office. And was doing that, thinking, I'm doing a great job here and I'm going to make all these people mentally stronger. But I have to say my interest in mental strength was more about helping other people than it was about my own life. And that changed when my mom, she passed away suddenly from a brain aneurysm. And she and I were really close. And it was sort of the first major loss I'd had in my life. And even though I was an adult, I was thinking, gosh, I'm not ready to live the rest of my life without my mom. And really started to invest in how do I go through this and come out stronger. I'd seen some people in my therapy office who had gone through all of these trials and hardships, and yet they emerged stronger. But I also saw some people that got stuck. They went through something and they just really couldn't move past that. So then from my own interest, I started studying what's the difference between people who can go through such hardship and come out okay on the other side, or that they used it in a way that was helpful. And I knew that, people say like, oh, time heals everything. Well, it doesn't. It's what you do with your time that matters. And I knew that grief is one of those things that we try to avoid. We are uncomfortable talking about death. We're uncomfortable being sad. We're uncomfortable seeing other people be sad. And so for so many people who had gone through a major loss in my office, I would see them and 20 years later, they still felt like their life was stuck, that they weren't able to really ever be happy again. And so from my own standpoint, I thought, all right, I just really want to know, how do I go through grief? How do I heal from this? And one of the things I noticed was that it wasn't always about what people did. Sometimes it was more about what they didn't do. That people who seemed to go through such hardships and come out okay had certain habits that they weren't doing. And so I started studying that really, really closely. And it took a long time to work through my own grief and to feel like I was doing okay and to sort of establish this new sense of normal in my life without my mom in it. And it was 3 years. It was really a cruel twist of fate. 3 years to the day that my mother died, that my 26-year-old husband died of a heart attack. And so I find myself this 26-year-old widow. I don't have my mom. I'm supposed to be a therapist who helps other people deal with their problems, but my own life was flipped upside down and felt like it was in shambles. And I had to figure out, now what do I do? How do I move forward after this? And my heart was broken. And again, it took a really long time, but I'd already started to learn about some of those bad habits that I didn't want to do. And I just really applied them to my life and figured out, okay, don't feel sorry for myself. Don't get stuck making the same kinds of mistakes over and over. What else can I not do as I'm working on this? And it took years before I sort of created this new path for my life. My husband and I had been foster parents, and we'd bought a house, and we had all these dreams, and I had to figure out, how do I let go of certain dreams? How do I hold on to some of them that I still want to do as a single person? But it took a long time to sort all of that out. And after a few years, friends would start to say, "Are you going to date again?" And my answer was no. I had sort of figured, no, I was fortunate. I found love once and I was married, and that was great. But that all changed. I met Steve, fell in love again, got married, and I thought, this is great. It's my next chapter in life. And we bought a new house. I got a new job, and it was like this new chapter. But pretty quickly after we got married, Steve's dad got diagnosed with cancer. And at first, doctors said, well, it's treatable. We've got this. But then a couple of months later, they said, actually, we don't. It's spreading, and we think it's terminal. And I thought, I can't lose another loved one. Rob had become this father figure in my life, and we were really close. And I just thought, why me? Why do I have to keep losing people? This isn't fair. I don't want to see Steve lose a parent, and was just really digging in my heels. And I remembered, okay, well, if there's anything that will keep me stuck, it would be feeling sorry for myself. And so I thought mentally strong people don't feel sorry for themselves. And so I sat down and I wrote a list of all the things mentally strong people don't do. It was things that I'd learned in my therapy office over the years, all of those bad habits that we're so tempted to do, but that they drain our mental strength. And when I was done, I had a list of 13 things on this list, and I would read the list to myself over and over in the next few days, and I found it really helpful. So I thought, well, maybe if it helps me, maybe it could help somebody else. So I published it online thinking it would maybe resonate with a couple of people. And I stepped away from my computer and then learned it was being read millions of times within a matter of days. And it went on to be read 50 million times. And before I knew it, I was getting phone calls from, CNN in Mexico and Fox News and all of these news stations. And and they want to talk to me about mental strength and what it means to be mentally strong. And they had all assumed that I had written the list because I was a therapist and I'd conquered all of these things. And the list, when I wrote it and published it online, it really gave no context. Nobody knew it was a letter to myself. I didn't tell the backstory. And so I find myself privately grieving. At that point, my father-in-law passed away just about 2 weeks after I wrote that list. And so, but nobody knew. So I'm on national TV. Forbes interviews me. Forbes even picks up the article, and it gets 10 million views on their site. So everybody's
Wow.
talking about mental strength, but nobody knows. And so I don't publicly share the whole story. I just explain, that as a therapist, I've learned these things over the years. But I was fortunate that in the midst of all of that, a literary agent called and said, you should write a book. And to be honest, I didn't even know what a literary agent was. I had no plans of ever writing a book. Unfortunately, she followed up with me a few days later because I sort of just blew her off, because when you have something that goes mega viral, I mean, my email and my phone were just blowing up with people calling and offering and telling me, give me $10,000 and I'll create a course for you. Or
Yeah,
and so
sure.
she sort of got lost in the mix. And fortunately, she called back, and I met with her and figured out, oh, she's the real deal. And so within a few weeks after that, we had a publishing deal with HarperCollins, and within the year, my first book came out, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, and I got to share the backstory of why I wrote the list in the first place.
Yeah, and something that sticks out there to me is you didn't set out to. I mean, I'm guessing you had no idea how successful it would end up being, but you wrote it for yourself. It wasn't this idea of let me write this article. You wrote it because you were experiencing it. You wrote it because you needed it, and it ended up touching a lot of people. And I mean, did you ever think at any point along the way like you were alone in this and nobody else would ever experience this? And after writing it, did you find other stories like yours? Because I think, just in my experience, I've found that so many people keep things to themselves, and it's when you actually begin talking about it, you realize you're not alone, and other people go through similar situations. What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, as a therapist, I knew, because I have people come in my office all day long every day, and they all have, somewhat similar stories of hardship, of heartache, things that they've been through. but I never share my story.
Yeah.
And so it was just really the first time I ever kind of put any of that out there. And certainly since then, I mean, my email to this day gets flooded with people who are telling me, gosh, I felt like you were talking to me. That story really related to me. And sometimes it's people who, I mean, we all experience loss in some ways. Even if you haven't lost a loved one, you've at least lost something. Maybe you've gone through a divorce or you've lost jobs. We all grieve certain things in our lives.
Yeah.
And yet we don't really talk about it. Everybody's posting on social media all the great things that are happening to them. And we don't really talk about, gosh, I'm really sad today. And in fact, if you do, your friends will most likely try to cheer you up or change the subject. It's really hard to really just talk openly about heartache and pain and that sort of a thing. As a culture, I think we're so uncomfortable with it. And me too. I wasn't going to necessarily share my story when the literary agent called me and said I should write a book. She didn't know the story behind it, and I didn't tell her until the second or third time I talked to her. And I said, but I don't know if I want to tell my story. And she said, well, you don't have to, but you might want to think about it. That adds a little more credibility to your story if you share how you've learned this stuff. And I'm glad that I did now. And it's, almost funny to me now to think I didn't, that I would have kept that a secret. But I think it just is so deeply ingrained in us sometimes about how do you talk about things in a healthy way? How can we open up to each other and say, hey, I'm hurting here? And then how do we respond when other people do that to us?
Yeah, that's an important point. And kind of going along the way in your journey, something that I think all of us are maybe chasing or wanting, or at least top of mind, is happiness. And at what point in the journey would you say, I mean, were you immediately thinking, I have to become happy again? Was it through writing this that you found happiness? Where does happiness fit in? And this question is coming from, I currently have a friend that's dealing with a deep depression personally, and he can't get himself to do anything. And just from talking with him, it's, you want to help them, but at some point that person makes the choice. That person has to do something about it. Um, what would you say? Maybe the best question is, how does one find happiness in a situation like yours? Is there some points, some tips you can tell us here, or is it different for everybody else?
Well, I think it comes in the beginning, especially. It comes in like a little flicker of happiness where you think, is it okay to be happy? And there was a sense of guilt of I shouldn't be smiling or I shouldn't be laughing. And then, or when there'd be moments of happiness, it would be also the thought of, but will I ever truly be happy again, or will this ever last? Will I ever actually be able to find true joy and happiness, or am I just going to have moments where I laugh for a couple of seconds and then it's over? And so I think there's a lot of turmoil around happiness, and even as a culture, our ideas about happiness are really misaligned. That there's the notion that we're all supposed to be happy all the time, or that you should be happier, or that there's something wrong with you if you aren't happy all the time. And you can find a million articles online about happiness, how to make yourself happier. And so I think for a lot of people, there's just that pressure of I should be happier. And then let's say you're a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10 in happiness, you think, well, I should be an 8. And then suddenly your 6 drops down to a 3 because you're feeling really bad that you're not as happy as you should be. And I see this all the time with people in my therapy office who will say, I should be happier, or my friends are happier than I am. And a lot of times they're just talking about what their friends are posting on Facebook, which isn't even necessarily accurate. But we get this idea that we should be happier. So I think one thing is to just embrace the moment. Know that you don't have to be happy all the time. In fact, if you were happy all the time, you wouldn't appreciate it. That the sad times can help you appreciate the good times, and that your emotions aren't necessarily wrong. And that when you feel guilty or you feel scared or anxious, all of those things are okay. And that can be part of the healing process. So it's okay to go through all of that. But at the same time, your emotions don't control you. You don't have to stay stuck there. Whether you wake up on the wrong side of the bed or you've been going through a rough patch, you can change your behavior, you can change the way you think and take some control over your mood. Whether you decide I'm going to start exercising, or I'd rather just sit at home and watch TV, but instead I'm going to go out with a friend in hopes that that will make me feel a little bit better. Sometimes you just have to take that leap of faith. I'm going to do something that's contrary to how I feel to see if that will make me feel better. And, we tend to do something that keeps us stuck in whatever mood we're in. If you made a list of what you do when you're happy, and then you made a list of the things you do when you're having a really bad day and you're in a bad mood, it's probably a very different list. So one of the keys can be, if you want to boost your mood, do something that you do when you feel happy happy, even though you aren't feeling it, whether you listen to music or you go for a walk outside, and just do those things. And that can boost your mood almost instantly. But on the flip side, to remember, you don't have to force happiness all the time.
That is a good reminder as well. Because, like you said, when you're not feeling happy 100% of the time, then you start questioning, why am I not as happy as so and so? Or why am I not an 8 and I'm a 6? And it just seems like, yeah, in my own life, if I'm chasing happiness, that it's almost like, you focus on it and you can't get to it. It's the things that you do behind the scenes that is what gets you there.
Exactly. And I see a lot of people that do something that makes them happy right now, whether you eat that extra piece of cake or you stay up really late. Partying with your friends makes you happy for a second, but then in the long term, it sabotages your long term happiness. So, for some people to recognize too that when you set out to do a new goal, you're going to reach hard times when you don't feel like moving forward. It's going to be painful, but it's worth it in the long run.
And now I want to jump into the book. We've talked a lot about your story, and thank you so much for sharing that. I got a lot out of it, and I think listeners will too. And I don't want to give the whole book away here, but out of your book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, would you say that there were one or two points that maybe came before the rest of them that you felt immediately, things that you find most useful for people, things that you maybe had more content on in your mind to write the chapters than the other chapters?
I think one of the chapter I get the most questions, comments, or feedback about is number 2, that mentally strong people don't give away their power. And that one is really about saying, nobody's in control of me. I'm in control of how I think, feel, and behave. Because I run into so many people and they'll say, well, my boss ruined my day. No, nobody ruined your day. It's up to you to decide what kind of day you're going to have. Or it's really, I think as a culture, we tend to use a lot of language that implies we don't have control over how we spend our time when we say, oh, I have to do something, like I have to go to the grocery store, I have to go to work tomorrow. You're sort of implying that somebody's making you do it, and just recognizing, no, it's a choice. And yeah, there's consequences. If you didn't go to work, then you might not get paid or you might get fired. But just acknowledging, okay, this is a choice. And that can help take back your power to say, how do I want to live my life? What do I want to do with my time? Where do I want to spend my energy? And that all of that is up to you.
And so, just to clarify, do you think that everything that happens, well, maybe not everything that happens to us is a choice, but I mean, we choose almost everything in our life that, not that happens to us, but our actions and reactions form our life?
Exactly. Yes, that you can always control something, and maybe it's your effort, maybe it's your attitude, but to just keep that in mind of, okay, I'm in control. Nobody's forcing me to live in misery, but I can make a choice. And I think just taking that power back can be really powerful. And maybe somebody did make you do something. People who've been in abusive situations, but to know that, again, even if you've had to go through something horrific like that, that you still then have choices when you come out on the other side of how you want to live your life and what you want to do with your time and who you want to be as a person.
That's really good. And something you say in the book that really stuck out to me was, you say that you are only as good as your worst habits. And it got me thinking about my worst habits that I immediately wanted to change. But my question to you on that is, how do we begin breaking bad habits? Are there tips that you can give us? Because, I mean, there's a few in my own life that, I think about them, but I still do them. And I think it's because they've been in the mix for so long that it's just habit. But I want to break them. So what advice would you give on that?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to first just recognizing them, because sometimes we just sweep them under the rug. And some people, it really drives them crazy that I wrote a book about what not to do. And they really feel like they have to switch it around and say, well, no, let's write a book about what mentally strong people do. And I've actually had some people rewrite the article
Hmm.
and frame it in the positive. But I think that that's different, that, it only takes one or two bad habits to keep you stuck. And there's so much information out there about all the things you should do with your life. But I would see it in my therapy office. If people just had one bad habit, they might have 10 great habits, but that one bad habit counteracted all their hard work. And it's about working smarter, not just harder. And so I think just recognizing what are your bad habits, and maybe you have bad mental habits. Maybe you call yourself names, or maybe you tend to give up at the first sign of discomfort, but to just recognize, what are my bad habits? What kinds of things do I do? And then to recognize, what do you get out of having that in life? Because we keep them there for a reason. They're comfortable. It's what we know. It's easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's what we reach for. And so acknowledge that and then figure out, what am I going to do then if I don't have that crutch to lean on? What can I do instead? And how am I going to deal with the discomfort that it stirs up? And even if we talked about, say, physical strength, maybe somebody goes to the gym and they work out, but they also eat a dozen donuts for breakfast every day. And then, so you say, well, eating your dozen donuts really counteracts all the work that you're doing at the gym. Why don't you just give up eating all those donuts, and then you wouldn't have to worry so much about the work you're putting into at the gym? But for a lot of people, we do that in life. And it sounds ridiculous that somebody would do that if they were building physical strength. But when it comes to mental strength, we do the same thing. We think, okay, I'm going to be strong today. I'm going to speak up to this person, or I'm going to make this healthy choice. But then we're calling ourselves names, or we're talking ourselves out of doing something at the first hint of self-doubt. So it's really about just acknowledging him and then figuring out, why do I do this? What do I get out of it? And then coming up with a plan. What am I going to do instead? Or what am I going to do when I do that? If you're somebody who calls yourself names, how are you going to respond the next time you do it? Because it's such a habit, and it's probably so ingrained that it's not going to go away overnight. But what can you do instead? Maybe it's coming up with a healthier script, something kinder to say to yourself. Or maybe it's a behavioral habit. Maybe you come home and you watch TV after work. You want to go to the gym, but you end up just going home and watching TV and sitting on the couch all night. Well, what can you do to change that? Maybe it's keeping your gym sneakers in your car. Maybe it's writing a note and putting it on your steering wheel that says, top 10 reasons I should go to the gym today, and make yourself read that list. But come up with something that will set you up for success so that you can really address that one bad habit at a time.
Good advice there. And you mentioning the title of your book. Yeah, I mean, if I were to write it, it would have been 13 Things Mentally Strong People Do, because I wouldn't have thought of the don't do. And I really appreciated that. It's almost easier because there's all sorts of things that mentally strong people could do. But you
Right.
say 13 things don't do these, you're going to live a better life. And I think the way you wrote it is actually more useful. And so I was listening to a podcast yesterday about looking at things from different perspectives. That's how we have different ideas. And I just think yours is such a different idea for that reason.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. The other thing that stuck out for me in the book was this constant theme of working from a place of having values. And it's something that's not talked about a lot. And I found that really interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Operating from a place of values. Yeah, it
Yep.
seemed to stick out through your writing in, I want to say, 3 or 4 different places. And so if you don't mind, maybe talk about that for just a little bit here, because I found that really interesting.
I find that so many of us, and I'm guilty of this too, we go about our daily business, and you get so caught up in the hustle and bustle of daily life that you kind of forget the big picture of what's important. And because of that, we end up not doing the things we wanted to do. Before you know it, a year goes by, 10 years go by, and you think, well, this isn't where I imagined I would be. Or you're putting all your emphasis on things that aren't that important to you just because that's the habit that you've gotten into. So I think it's really important to take a step back and say, well, what do I value? How important is my health? How important is my family? How much do friends mean to me? How much do I value money, education? I mean, the list could go on, but just knowing what's really important in life. And, I think it's important for you as a person, but also for people with families. They've done studies on this where they'll ask kids, for example, what do your parents value more? Would they rather that the teacher said that you were the nicest kid in the class or that you were the smartest kid in the class? And almost all the kids say, oh, my parents want me to be the smartest kid. But then when they asked the parents, almost every parent said, I guess I'd rather that they say my kid is the nicest kid. But then you take a step back and you think, well, how much emphasis do you put on being a nice person? You probably talk about homework, you talk about getting good grades and studying for tests, but how often do you talk about being nice? And, I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many of the problems that we see these days with the pressure that kids feel to cheat or to get, because they think getting a good score is better than anything else. It's above being honest. So I just think it's so important for us as individuals to know, what do we really value? How important is achievement versus being a kind human being? And either way, it's okay if you truly value achievement, but we just need to know that, I think. And then your decisions in life become much easier when you know what your values are and what's most important to you.
It's really interesting. You talking about asking kids what their parents would value more. It just reminds me of how early people pleasing begins in people's lives. I mean, from elementary school, you're trying to please other people. And I guess that's the way it's supposed to be set up because there has to be order between the parent and the kid. But it's almost like the kid's self esteem is in pleasing not only their parents, but their teachers. You grow up and you get into an educational system where you're ranked between people. Then you go on. I'm a recovering people pleaser saying this and constantly working at that. But that's what that reminds me of. I don't know if you have anything to say on that, but it seems like a lot of times people grow up finding their worth in what other people think of them. And that just reminded me that it starts way earlier than when you are an adult. It's when you're a kid, and that's the way you grow up, learning to find value in what other people think of you.
Absolutely. And I think that this has only gotten worse in the face of social media, that we now have Facebook, and we want to make sure that, we look really good on Facebook, or you want to make sure that other people are pleased with what you're doing when you present your life in a certain way. And I think there's just all of these added pressures these days to try to make sure that you're somehow making other people happy, even though on an intellectual level, people can say, well, I know I'm not responsible for how someone feels, but on the other hand, I don't want to say no to them because it might hurt their feelings, or they might think differently of me. And then it just becomes so easy and fast that you lose sight of your values because you're just doing what you think other people want you to do. And you kind of forget who you are and what's really important to you.
Really good. And Amy, I really enjoyed this conversation and kind of wrapping up here, but you've offered us so much today. You could highlight something that we've already talked about. It could be something that we didn't get to talk about today. But if there's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave listeners with, what would that be?
I think one of the simplest ways, if you want to build mental strength, is to practice gratitude.
Hmm.
And if you just, even whether you are somebody who writes in a gratitude journal, or you just make it a habit that over dinner with your family, you just say, what are 3 things you're grateful for? The studies on gratitude show you sleep better, you live longer, you're healthier, you're more likely to take care of yourself, you have better relationships. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's free and it takes maybe 2 minutes of your time, but to incorporate gratitude into your life, it changes the way you think, changes the way you feel, and changes the way you behave, which is the hallmark of mental strength. So I think that's just one really simple and easy way to make a difference in your life every day.
I love that advice. And we're nearing 50 interviews on this show in the 3rd season now. And we've touched on gratitude with other guests, but I don't think anybody's left that as their last piece of advice. And I can attest to that. I didn't always consciously go to what I'm grateful for, but once I did, it completely changed my life. So thank you for that. And I think that's going to help a lot of people.
Excellent.
And last question for you, Amy, where would you like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
My website, which is Amy Morin, LCSW, is in licensed clinical social worker.com, and it has information about my books and my TEDx talk and my course and lots of other things about mental strength on there.
All right, perfect. Thanks again, Amy. I had a wonderful conversation with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.